I'm Grace Ellison, 32 years old, and on the night I stuck a skinny candle into a grocery store cake in my Brooklyn walk-up, the phone on my counter started buzzing, like it had something urgent to confess. I answered with frosting on my thumb, and a careful voice told me it was time to read my parents' will. The words landed hard in a kitchen that never felt smaller, and then everything got narrower still when my younger sister was named heir to a Westchester place, worth $750,000, while I was left a weather-beaten cabin in Alaska with a key the color of rust. Aaron stood there in his tie from work, like he'd just remembered he had better places to be. He set the ring on the table and called me a failure. Without raising his voice, the door latch clicked. The hallway carried his footsteps away, and I was alone with a metal key, an old deed in my grandfather's name, and a note from my mother that said, "Only, you'll understand why it had to be you." Before I say another word, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to prove your worth after being counted out, tap that like and subscribe, so I know you're here with me. I grew up in a house that believed the good things in life should be weighed and measured square footage, test scores, the kind of trophies that gleam under a lamp. My father Charles left before sunrise with black coffee and a rolled blueprint under his arm, and he admired bridges most when you could see the span and point to the math that held it up. My mother Margaret kept the library at the high school, where the dust smelled soft and familiar, and she had a way of smoothing any conflict with a kind word, even when that kindness meant looking down at her hands instead of up at the person who needed defending. My sister Jenna had a gift for finding the center of the room and lighting it. Every picture she took caught the brightest angle, and people remembered her name without trying. I learned early that my talents didn't clatter on the table the way trophies did. I wrote, I listened. I hung back until the story was ready to be told, so I worked nights after homework, saved tips for books, and told myself that quiet work still counted, even if no one clapped. When money was tight, my first summer job was mopping a diner floor that picked up more footprints than it ever let go. The next summer, I flew to Alaska to stay with my grandfather Walter, who didn't need words to fill a day. He'd walk a slow line along the Susitna, tapping the tip of his cane on driftwood, and he'd say things in a steady way that made them feel already tested by weather. Never overlook what looks worn, never rush a thing that can last. We spent whole afternoons repairing what other people would burn an oar split down the grain, a chair with a leg too short, a leaky tin roof, and he'd nod when the fix held and say nothing when it didn't, because trying again was part of the plan. Back home in the fall, our town would tilt toward the high school stadium lights, and I'd pass the bleachers at the far end, the place where it was easy to go unnoticed, while Dad talked up the varsity roster, and Mom tucked my latest essay under a pizza box with the promise she'd read it later. I learned to stop asking for applause at the same time I learned to write without it. By the time I was old enough to stand on my own billable hours, New York felt like a pact I'd made with myself: live small, work long, keep the light on, and trust that the next call would lead to the next job. Brooklyn taught me to make peace with thin walls and street noise and the kind of neighbors who shared the good chairs only on the stoop. It also taught me how a person can be surrounded and still feel like she's holding her breath. Aaron liked that I had drive and that I dressed like I respected a calendar, but he liked results, even more numbers to quote ladders, to climb photos that told people he chose well. I kept telling myself we wanted the same stability from different directions. He kept telling me that someday I'd see his way was faster. When the attorney said reading of the will, I thought first of the quiet spaces that follow bad news, the rooms where people fold their hands and talk around the thing that hurts, not the rooms where a life is itemized and divided with the click of a pen. I sat with that key on my kitchen table and tried to picture a cabin past a road that might not be plowed, where the wind pulls at the eaves until the boards answer back, and a deed that carried my grandfather's last name, but not my father's certainty about what counted. The contrast made the room feel colder. Jenna framed in a doorway of a house with crown molding and a lawn that drinks a sprinkler's arc. Me squinting at a map that turns the forest to a pale green blur. The note from my mother was only one line, the kind you read twice and feel both seen and unsteady, because trust is heavy when you've spent years trying to earn it in other ways. I slipped the key into my pocket, Not because I'd decided anything yet, but because it felt wrong to leave it on the table where the ring had been, and I told myself I could handle a lawyer's conference room without bracing for anything but the formal words that always follow a loss. I didn't know walking into that glass building the next morning that the first sharp cut hadn't happened yet, and that by the time I walked back out, every old bruise would have a fresh edge. The next morning, I took the subway to Midtown with the manila envelope still tucked in my coat pocket. The air was cold enough to sting, and the noise of the city had a hollow edge, as if it already knew the day would not end kindly. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the marble lobby beneath a wall of mirrored glass that made everyone look smaller than they were. I could see my reflection in the elevator doors, pale tired, holding a paper cup of water that trembled slightly in my hand. When the receptionist called my name, I stood and followed her down a hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The conference room door was open, and Jenna was already inside. She wore a tan coat and heels that clicked neatly across the floor. Her hair was polished, her makeup soft, the way people look when they've already practiced what face to wear. She smiled just enough to seem gracious, then glanced at her phone as if she had somewhere better to be. Aaron sat beside her, his jacket pressed so flat it could have been ironed onto him. He didn't reach for my hand. He gave me the kind of nod people use when they pass a stranger in a waiting room. The lawyer, Mr. Riley, motioned for us to sit. He was kind in a careful way, quiet voice, silver glasses, papers arranged in perfect order. "I'm sorry for your loss," he began, looking between us. "Your parents left clear instructions. I'll read them exactly as written." His tone was steady, almost mechanical, the way someone sounds when they've said the same words too many times in the same room. He opened the folder and read each line slowly, his pen tapping once against the table after every paragraph. "To our younger daughter, Jenna Ellison, we leave the property located in Westchester County, appraised at $750,000, along with the majority of remaining financial assets." Jenna's lips parted in what might have been surprise, though I doubted it. She tilted her head, saying softly, "That's generous." Her eyes flicked toward me just long enough to measure my reaction. Mr. Riley turned a page. "To our elder daughter, Grace Ellison, we bequeath the property listed under Mercer Lot, near Talkeetna, Alaska. All deeds and documents pertaining to this land are enclosed." He paused as though waiting for me to ask what that meant. The room stayed silent except for the clock on the wall, its second hand ticking too loudly. Aaron exhaled a small laugh that didn't belong in a room like this. "So a cabin," he said under his breath. "Rustic, right?" His voice carried just enough for Jenna to hear. She smiled into her coffee cup. "Mr." Riley finished reading, closed the folder, and slid a separate envelope toward me. "This includes the deed and a key," he said quietly. "Your parents left no written explanation, only a short note in your mother's handwriting." I nodded without opening it. My palms were damp against the table. Aaron shifted in his seat, checking his watch, as though the will had confirmed something he already knew about me. Outside the conference room, the fluorescent lights made the hallway look even colder. Aaron waited until we were clear of the receptionist before speaking. "Grace, you can't build a future on sentiment," he said. "Life's about results, not feelings. You've got to accept that." He adjusted his cufflinks and gave me the same measured look he used when closing a deal. "I can't keep doing this. I need a partner who's moving forward." His words sounded practiced, like he'd said them in his head a few times to get the tone right. Then came the quiet, metallic sound of the ring as he placed it on the receptionist's desk before walking away. I could hear the low buzz of conversation from other offices, but no one looked up. Jenna lingered by the elevator, scrolling her phone. "Don't be upset," she said with a sigh that wasn't sympathy. "Everyone has their lane. Maybe this one just suits you better off the grid, creative, low maintenance." Her perfume hung in the air after she left, sweet and heavy. I walked out through the lobby and into the noise of the city. Taxi horns, conversations, the smell of pretzels and exhaust. It all pressed close, but none of it seemed to touch me. The glass of the building caught my reflection again, small and faint against the skyline. Back home in Brooklyn, the apartment felt hollow. I set the envelope on the kitchen table beside the leftover birthday cake. The key inside was rough, its edges worn smooth by time. The metal caught the light like it was remembering something older than me. The deed was stamped with my grandfather's name, Walter Harper, and below it coordinates written in fading ink. For a long time I just stared at the papers. The difference between a mansion and a cabin wasn't just money, it was a sentence passed without words. My parents had known exactly what they were doing. They'd handed Jenna a future built on comfort, and handed me something that sounded like a burden. Aaron's voice echoed in the stillness. Results, not feelings. I thought of all the times I had worked quietly while others celebrated louder things, promotions, weddings, new homes. Maybe this was my family's final confirmation that I had never been the headline act. But folded between the deed and a map was the note from my mother. The ink was faint, her handwriting familiar from years of grocery lists and birthday cards. You'll understand why it had to be you. I read it again, then again, until the words blurred. The simple weight of that sentence pressed against everything else in the room. When night fell, I opened my laptop and looked up flights to Anchorage. The cost made my throat tighten, but I didn't close the page. Instead, I typed in the destination again, slower this time, as though spelling it out might help me believe it. The next morning, I stood at my small window watching the early light move between the rooftops. I had two choices: sell the land without ever seeing it, or go there myself and find out what my mother meant. Both paths would end the same way financially, but only one felt like it might give me an answer. I packed a small suitcase with winter clothes, the kind meant more for short trips than for the wilderness. The city outside my window looked gray and unbothered, as if nothing I did could ever shift it. I slipped the key into my pocket, zipped my coat, and left the apartment. At the airport, the line moved slowly. Families clustered together in their bright travel clothes. A child laughed behind me, holding a paper cup of cocoa that steamed in the cold. When my ticket printed the name Anchorage, looked unreal in black letters across the top. I folded it into my passport and waited for boarding to begin. Somewhere between the gate and the plane, I realized I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Not Jenna, not Aaron, not a single friend. There was no one left who needed to know. As the plane lifted through the clouds, the city lights dissolved into darkness, and I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: quiet, uncertain freedom. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes. The rusted key was warm in my palm, pressed tight inside my coat pocket. I didn't know yet what waited in that cabin, but for the first time since the will was read, I wasn't afraid to find out. The flight from New York to Anchorage felt longer than it looked on the ticket. I watched the map crawl slowly across the screen, the dotted line stretching over half the country, and thought about the last time I'd seen my grandfather's face. He'd been sitting on the porch of his cabin in a plaid jacket, holding a mug of coffee that steamed against the cold. The air had smelled of pine and smoke. That was almost 15 years ago. When the plane touched down, the door opened to a sharp gust of dry air that seemed to scrape the city out of my lungs. The world outside was gray and still. Snow packed tight against curbs, and every step on the tarmac gave a hollow crunch. Anchorage wasn't what I'd imagined. It wasn't wilderness exactly, but it wasn't city either. It looked like a place that had learned to survive by keeping things simple. Inside the small terminal, people greeted each other with quick nods, as if they all knew someone waiting down the road. I rented a 4-wheel drive truck, but the clerk insisted on assigning me a local driver for the last leg. "You'll want someone who knows the back roads," she said. GPS cuts out past Talkeetna. His name was Tom Barrett, a man with a weathered face and hands shaped by decades behind a steering wheel. His parka was faded red, his beard trimmed short, and when he spoke, his voice had the rasp of someone used to shouting over engines. He loaded my duffel bag into the truck without a word, then held out a thermos. "Coffee," he said. "You'll need it." The drive north was quiet except for the low hum of tires over packed snow. Trees crowded both sides of the highway, black spruce and birch, their trunks streaked with frost. Now and then we'd pass a frozen river, a gas station, a mailbox leaning sideways from the wind. Tom glanced at me after an hour and said, "You're heading to Mercerland, right?" When I nodded, he gave a slow whistle. Not many folks go out that way anymore. That trail's more snow than road this time of year. He didn't ask why I was going. People here seemed to understand that everyone had their own kind of reason. We stopped in Talkeetna just before dusk. The truck rolled to a halt in front of a small roadhouse built of dark logs and warm light. Inside, the air was thick with coffee and the smell of fresh bread. A few locals sat at tables in heavy coats, their conversations low and steady. The woman behind the counter smiled when she saw me. "Cold day to be traveling," she said. "You passing through or staying a while?" Her name was Anna Redbird, and she owned the place with her husband who was out running supplies. When I told her where I was headed, she raised her eyebrows slightly. "That's old Mercer country. Folks still talk about him, your grandfather. Hard worker, quiet man. Always paid fair when he hired locals to help." She poured me another cup of coffee before I could finish the first. "Most of that land's been untouched since he passed. You sure you want to go out there alone?" I smiled faintly, though I wasn't sure of the answer myself. "I'll manage," I said. Tom returned from the truck brushing snow off his hat. "We've got about an hour's light left," he said. "If we push, we'll reach the trailhead by sunset." I thanked Anna for the coffee and packed a few pastries she offered for the road. As we drove out of town, she stood in the doorway waving once before disappearing back inside. The road narrowed until it became a single lane carved between snowbanks. The trees pressed closer, their branches heavy with ice. When the truck finally stopped, Tom pointed toward a narrow path almost buried under snow. "That's where it starts," he said. "About a mile, maybe a bit more. Can't take the truck past here." I handed him the payment and offered a handshake. He took it with a firm grip, his eyes steady. "Be careful out there," he said. "Weather turns fast. If you get in trouble, follow the river south till you hit town." The wind caught his words and carried them into the trees. He turned the truck around and drove off, leaving only the rumble of the engine fading behind me. The forest was quiet except for the soft hiss of falling snow. I adjusted my backpack, pulled my scarf higher, and stepped onto the trail. Each foot sank deep, the sound of the crunch echoing like a heartbeat. The air smelled of pine sap and cold metal. The GPS flickered on my phone but held long enough to guide me forward. After what felt like hours, I saw the outline of a slanted roof through the trees. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, crouched beneath a weight of snow, like an old man bowing against time. The boards were darkened with mold, the windows clouded from within. One shutter dangled loose, tapping lightly in the wind. I climbed the porch steps, each one groaning beneath my boots. The door stuck before giving way with a sharp cry from the hinges. The smell inside was thick mildew old ash and the sour trace of animals. My flashlight beam slid across walls streaked with water stains and furniture half collapsed under dust. A single chair still stood near the fireplace, its cushion torn open, stuffing spilling like yellowed feathers. The floorboards creaked under my weight. Mouse tracks ran across a table where a rusted lantern sat half filled with dried oil. I set my pack down and rubbed my hands together, trying to stir warmth back into them. The silence pressed close, broken only by the wind sliding through a cracked window. I lit the small camping stove I'd brought and poured water into a tin cup. The hiss of the flame felt almost like company. As the light from my lantern spread across the room, I caught sight of a faded photograph pinned crooked above the hearth. It showed my grandfather standing beside a young woman I didn't recognize, both squinting into the sun. Behind them, the same cabin looked new roof, straight walls, clean a dog sitting proudly at their feet. The contrast made my chest ache. That first night, I unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the broken window. The fire sputtered once and then steadied, painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. Outside branches scraped against the siding. Somewhere in the woods, something moved slow, deliberate. I told myself it was only the wind. Sleep came in thin patches, the kind that never lets you forget where you are. Each sound snapped me awake, the groan of the roof, the soft patter of snow slipping off the eaves, the whisper of my own breath. At one point I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, heavy enough to rattle the loose boards. But when I listened harder, there was nothing. When morning came, gray light spilled through the cracks in the shutters. My body ached from the cold, my fingers stiff and slow. I made a small fire, fed it scraps of dry wood from a crate near the wall, and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. I thought of Jenna back in Westchester, probably arranging furniture in her new house while sunlight poured through big windows. I thought of Aaron, his tidy apartment, his easy laugh, his world that never bent out of shape. And then I looked around this cabin, broken, forgotten, and felt a strange pull I couldn't name. I spent the rest of the morning clearing the dust, sweeping mouse droppings into piles, airing out the room. The smell of rot still clung to everything, but the act of cleaning gave me something to hold on to. Each motion steadied me, turned the silence into work instead of worry. By noon, I'd cleared enough space to set a small table upright. The wood beneath my boots groaned differently now, less brittle, more alive. As I swept the last corner, the broom caught on something uneven. I knelt down and brushed the dirt aside. One plank in the center of the floor looked darker than the rest, its grain running the wrong direction. I pressed my hand against it. The sound that came back was hollow. The wind rattled the window just then, a sound sharp enough to make me jump. I stood there staring at the plank, my breath clouding in the cold air. Whatever lay beneath it, I wasn't ready to look yet. Not that day. I moved my sleeping bag closer to the fire and sat down. Outside, the sun was already fading, turning the snow a soft silver blue. I poured the last of the coffee from my thermos and watched the steam drift toward the cracked ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once, and then went silent. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. The hollow sound of that single board echoed in my mind long after the fire burned down. And as the shadows deepened around the cabin, I had the uneasy feeling that the true reason my mother had written those words, "You'll understand why it had to be," was waiting beneath my feet, quiet and patient, until I found the courage to uncover it. By the third morning, the cabin no longer felt like something to tiptoe through. It was still cold, still cracked around the edges, but the fear had loosened its grip. The fire from the old stove gave off a low, steady heat that smelled faintly of pine and iron. I spent the morning sweeping again, brushing away a layer of ash that seemed to appear no matter how many times I cleaned. When I reached the center of the floor, the same uneven plank caught my broom and stopped me short. The darker wood stood out against the pale grain, its nails old and hand-forged, not the smooth kind you buy in hardware stores now. I crouched down, tracing the edges with my fingers. The hollow sound underneath it was unmistakable. I brushed the dust aside and found a rusted metal ring embedded in the corner. My breath misted as I knelt there, one hand on the ring, one braced against the floor. I pulled once hard. The plank lifted with a dry crack, releasing a wave of cold, damp air that smelled of soil and iron. Beneath it, a narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my flashlight and tested the first step. It creaked, but held. The deeper I went, the colder it became until my breath hung like smoke in front of me. At the bottom, my boots touched stone. The cellar was larger than I expected, low-ceilinged, hand-built from rock, the walls damp but solid. My flashlight beam caught a line of wooden crates stacked in the corner, each one marked with faint white lettering, Mercer Co. The paint had nearly peeled away, but the name still read clear enough to tighten something in my chest. I ran my hand over the nearest crate, feeling the ridges of old wood. Using my pocket knife, I pried up one side. The lid splintered, the sound echoing through the narrow space. Inside were canvas sacks tied with cord and dark with age. I untied the first knot and the light caught on something yellow and heavy coins, dozens of them packed tight. I reached in and lifted one. The metal was cold, heavier than I expected. Gold. For a long minute I just stared at it, the light from my flashlight glinting off the surface. I opened another crate. Silver bars tarnished but solid. A third held jewelry necklaces, brooches, and rings, their stones dulled by time. The air seemed to thicken, pressing close around me. Across the room, half buried in dust, stood a larger chest bound with leather straps. I forced the latch open and found rows of leather-bound books, inside their spines, brittle pages yellowed. The top one had my grandfather's name written across the front, Walter Harper. Inside, the handwriting was careful and small, every number and date written in straight columns. Each page listed parcels of land timber rights and long-term mining leases stretching back decades. Attached maps showed boundaries that stretched far beyond this cabin, miles of forest, rivers, and hills. The next ledger held contracts with signatures and embossed seals. Some were for mineral extraction, lithium, copper, rare earth elements, and all were notarized. The third ledger contained pipeline agreements and royalty terms signed by companies I recognized from modern headlines. The numbers in the margins climbed higher with each page. I sat down on the cold stone floor, the books spread open around me. My flashlight rested on a nearby crate, casting the room in a circle of gold light. I pulled out my phone and started to add up the figures, hands trembling as I punched each number in. Even with rough estimates, the total came to something so large I had to check twice. The gold and silver alone were worth millions, but the land rights, the active leases, those were the real fortune. I leaned back against the wall, the cold seeping through my coat, and felt the weight of everything I'd believed crash into something entirely new. My parents hadn't left me a burden. They'd left me a secret, a legacy that required silence and patience, not celebration. When I climbed back up the steps, the light from the main room felt too bright. I replaced the floorboard, pressed it back into place, and dragged the rug over it. My hands shook as I reached for my notebook. On the first page, I wrote 3 words. I found it. Then below that, I began to list what I'd seen: the crates, the ledgers, the signatures. Each detail mattered now. Night fell quickly, the light outside fading to a blue-gray haze. I made a fire and sat beside it, trying to steady my breathing. I kept thinking of Jenna, of the way she'd smiled when the lawyer said her name, how sure she'd looked of her place in the world. I wondered what she'd say if she knew about this. And Aaron, his voice still sharp in my memory, the words "results, not feelings," echoing like a taunt. Neither of them could ever know about this, not yet. I stayed awake for hours, scanning every page of each ledger into my laptop, saving the files onto an external drive I'd packed by chance. When the scanning finished, I locked the drive in my backpack and slid it under my bedroll. Then I sealed the trapdoor again, this time with nails from the supply crate near the stove. By morning, I had a plan. I would take only a few small pieces, a handful of coins, and 1 necklace to Anchorage, enough to secure a safety deposit box and test whether the gold was genuine. The rest would stay hidden until I knew what to do. I packed the items carefully, wrapping them in a wool scarf, and started the hike back toward town. The snow had hardened overnight, the surface crisp and reflective. The path wound through trees heavy with frost, and the quiet felt like something watching rather than resting. When the roof of the roadhouse came into view, I felt my shoulders ease for the first time. Anna was behind the counter, wiping down mugs. She looked up as I stepped inside. "You made it back," she said with a small smile. "So the cabin's still standing after all these years." "It's standing," I said. "Barely." She poured coffee into a chipped white mug and slid it across the counter. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that." We sat for a while, the only sound the soft rattle of the stove fan. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the windows in soft, steady waves. When I finished my coffee, I rented a small lockbox at the local bank. The clerk didn't ask questions, just took my ID and handed me a key. The gold tested real. The jeweler who verified it raised his brows, but said nothing more. By the time I returned to the cabin that night, the wind had picked up. The snow hissed against the roof like sand. I lit a fire, spread the ledgers across the table, and opened the last one I hadn't read. Inside was a letter tucked between the final pages, its envelope yellowed but unsealed. My mother's handwriting curved softly across the front for grace. The words swam for a moment before my eyes focused. I opened it carefully. The ink had faded, but the writing was steady. "My dear Grace, if you're reading this, it means we are gone. Your father is not an easy man, but he always saw more than he said. He saw endurance in you, the kind that holds steady when the noise fades. We chose by trust, not by favor. This place and what lies beneath it needed someone who could keep quiet long enough to understand. You were that person. We always saw you even when it seemed we didn't." My eyes blurred halfway through. The paper trembled in my hands. I set it down carefully beside the fire. The flames caught the edges of the room, turning the walls a soft amber. I thought of all the years I had mistaken silence for indifference, and how my parents' quiet had been a kind of faith instead. The wind eased outside, and for the first time the cabin didn't sound like it was falling apart. It sounded like it was breathing again. I folded the letter, slipped it into a plastic sleeve to protect it, and placed it in my notebook. Later, when I stepped onto the porch, the sky above the trees was a deep silver. Snow glittered across the ground under the faint light of the moon. I could hear the river moving slowly beneath its crust of ice. The world felt vast and still, but no longer empty. I pulled my coat tighter and looked back at the cabin, the sagging roof, the patched window, the chimney releasing a thread of smoke. Beneath it all, under that dark plank of wood, a fortune waited. But for now I understood that the treasure wasn't the gold or the land. It was the trust my mother had written into that single line. Behind me the wind shifted, carrying the faint call of an owl from the woods. I stood there until the cold began to bite at my fingers. Then I went back inside, locked the door, and sat beside the fire, the letter warm in my hands. Tomorrow I would begin to decide what came next. But for tonight, I let the silence settle and the fire crackle low, knowing that somewhere between the darkness and the dawn, I had finally uncovered more than what was hidden beneath the floor. I had uncovered what it meant to be chosen. When morning came, the fire had burned down to quiet orange coals, and the light through the window was the color of pewter. I made coffee on the stove, letting the smell fill the cabin, and read my mother's letter again. Her words felt steadier this time, less like a secret and more like instructions. I folded it carefully, slipped it back into the notebook, and wrote down a single sentence under my notes from the night before. Do this right. The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate work, rest, and small repairs. I sealed the broken window with plastic until a proper pane could be cut, patched a leak in the roof with scrap wood, and scrubbed the walls with vinegar water until the air smelled less like rot. But every evening as the firelight spread across the floor, I kept thinking about what I'd found beneath it. Gold could vanish. Land could be stolen. The ledgers and contracts, though they were, something else entirely. They needed to be protected. I started my first trip back to Anchorage on a Tuesday morning. The drive down with Tom Barrett took most of the day. The roads were narrow and icy, lined with spruce trees that seemed to bend under the weight of their own snow. When we reached the edge of town, the sky had already turned pink with dusk. Tom dropped me off at a brick building just off 4th Avenue. "This is where you'll find real lawyers," he said with a faint smile. "Old-school ones, not the kind who chase billboards." Inside the office was warm and smelled faintly of paper and cedar polish. The plaque on the door read, "Levin and Cardenas, Land and Resource Law." Howard Levin came out from behind his desk, wearing a gray wool sweater under his blazer, his white hair combed straight back. He shook my hand firmly, the kind of handshake that felt both professional and personal. I told him what I had: my grandfather's ledgers, the contracts, the proof of ownership. He listened without interruption, taking notes in tight, even script. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Miss Ellison, if these documents are genuine, you hold something most people would never dream of owning, but it's also fragile. You'll need structure and protection." He verified the deeds, first tracing the title chain from my grandfather's estate to my parents' will and then to me. Every seal, every signature matched. "You have clear rights," he said finally, "but you'll want to hold them at arm's length. A personal name invites risk. A trust would shelter the assets while keeping control in your hands." That night I checked into a small inn on the edge of town, the kind where the hallways smelled faintly of pine soap and heating oil. I sat by the window looking out at the street lamps glowing through thin snow. I made a list of everyone who could never know what I'd found: Jenna Aaron, even a few friends back in Brooklyn who meant well but talked too freely. The next morning I met with Owen Sutter, the mineral appraiser Howard recommended. He arrived in a heavy flannel coat and carried a metal briefcase that looked older than I was. He had the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent his life underground and preferred it that way. After a short introduction, he unrolled his maps across the table and began comparing them to the coordinates from my ledgers. "If these leases are still honored," he said, tapping a pencil against one map, "you're sitting on rights to active rare earth deposits. Lithium mostly. This is serious value, but it's the kind of value that draws eyes you don't want." I took notes while he spoke. Every few sentences he looked up and made sure I was following. When he finished, he gave a small nod. "Don't sell quick. Verify first. The land's worth more than any single buyer will tell you. That afternoon, I met with a forester named Mark Chen from Fairbanks. He wore a down jacket dusted with snow and carried a field tablet tucked under his arm. We walked the property lines on a digital map, and he pointed out the sustainable sections versus the protected growth zones. You could clear-cut this place and retire early, he said, or you could manage it right and let it take care of you forever. He smiled slightly. Your grandfather did the second. You've got good soil here, old forest. Treat it like a living thing, not a ledger line. Those words stayed with me all the way back to the cabin. I reached it just as twilight was falling, the sky fading from silver to violet over the trees. I lit the stove and sat by the fire, spreading my notes out on the table. 1 page for timber, 1 for minerals, 1 for royalties. My notebook began to look like a map of decisions, each one leading away from the life I used to know. The next morning I drafted a plan. I would create the Harper Trust, named after my grandfather's line, to hold all land and asset rights. Howard would serve as its counsel and co-trustee for compliance. Then a management company under a different name would handle the operations quietly. In this way, I could keep control without flashing my name across any headline. Howard approved the structure, his pen moving steadily over the papers. Transparency where it matters, he said, and privacy everywhere else. We filed the trust documents within 2 weeks. It became real the day I saw my name listed as founder and sole beneficiary. When the legal work was done, I returned to Talkeetna to meet with Anna. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, only 2 men at the far end playing cards by the window. She poured me coffee without asking. "You've been busy," she said. "You've got that look people get when something's changing." "I think I'm just starting to understand what my grandfather left behind," I said. She smiled softly. "Then you're doing something right." The rest of the winter passed in steady days of rebuilding. I fixed the roof properly, replaced the glass window with help from a local craftsman, and hung a few framed photographs I'd taken of the forest in early light. Each small change made the cabin feel less like a ruin and more like a place that belonged again. One evening, as the snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, I turned on my phone for the first time in days. Messages poured in, missed calls, unread texts. Most were from Jenna, one from Aaron, short and sharp. "We need to talk." I let the screen go dark without answering. That night, I sat at the table, my mother's letter spread beside the ledgers. I read the line that had carried me this far. We chose by trust, not by favor, and understood it differently now. They hadn't been trying to exclude me. They had been giving me something that couldn't survive vanity or greed. The fire crackled softly, and I heard the wind pick up against the window. I realized I was no longer waiting for anyone's approval. Not Jenna's, not Aaron's, not even my father's voice in memory. The silence that had once felt heavy now felt like space room, to think room to grow. When spring began to edge into the valley, I walked out to the river behind the cabin. The ice had started to break the current, whispering beneath the melting crust. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth. I stood there a long time listening. I didn't know what would come next, how to balance all that value with the quiet life I wanted, but I knew I could start with one clear promise: I would honor what was given to me without letting it own me. As I walked back toward the cabin, the setting sun slipped through the trees, casting the snow in bands of gold. The air was still, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I looked at the cabin, at the new glass, catching the last of the light, and felt something settle in me. Inside the fire waited steady and warm. Tomorrow, I'd begin turning these plans into action calls, to make filings, to complete boundaries to draw. For tonight, I poured a cup of tea and watched the flames move across the logs, the letter from my mother resting safely beside me. I didn't yet know that the peace I felt in that moment would be tested soon, that the outside world was closer than I thought. But for now, the quiet was enough, and the sound of the fire filled the room like a promise still unfolding. Spring arrived quietly in Alaska, almost shy in the way it spread. The snow didn't melt all at once, it softened first, turning the ground slick underfoot. The air smelled different, though. It was cleaner, sharper, touched with pine and thawing soil. I spent the early mornings outside, sweeping the porch and watching the light reach through the trees. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. The roof was firm, the window glass clear, and when the fire burned in the stove at night, its glow was strong enough to push against the dark. The Harper Trust had been finalized 2 weeks earlier. Howard called to confirm the filings were complete and the assets secured. "You're officially the trustee now," he said. "The rest is up to you." The words stayed in my mind long after we hung up. I'd built structure around what I'd found, turned chaos into order, but I still hadn't told anyone. The fewer people who knew, the safer it felt. One afternoon, as I repaired the shelves above the fireplace, my phone buzzed. A text from Aaron appeared on the screen. "I'm in Anchorage. 10 minutes of your time. That's all I ask." I stared at it for a moment before replying. "Tomorrow, noon, Cafe Redbird." I knew he must have heard something rumors hints, maybe even the property registration buried in public records. The next day I arrived early. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and strong coffee. Anna was behind the counter humming softly while arranging a tray of pastries. When she saw my expression, she said only, "Trouble or closure?" "Maybe both," I said. Aaron walked in exactly on time. His coat tailored his hair, slicked back in the same precise way as before. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Grace," he said warmly, as if nothing had ever broken between us. "You look different. Alaska suits you." I folded my hands around the coffee mug. "You said you wanted 10 minutes. He leaned forward slightly. "I heard you inherited something unusual from your family. A land claim, maybe more. I'm not here to pry. I just want to talk clear the air." His voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to sound sincere while choosing every word for advantage. "I'm not sure there's anything left to clear," I said. He gave a small laugh. "Come on, Grace. We made mistakes, both of us. But I miss you. I miss what we had." His hand slid halfway across the table, stopping just short of mine. "I think we could start over." I watched him for a moment, noticing how easily he slipped into the rhythm of persuasion. "You called me a failure in front of strangers, Aaron. What exactly would we be starting over from?" His smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I was angry. You have to know that." I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. "You had 10 minutes. You've used them." "Grace, I'm not angry anymore," I said quietly, "but I'm not the same person you left." I walked to the counter, thanked Anna for the coffee, and stepped outside. The air was cool and bright, and the snow on the ground glittered like glass. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of unfinished words. Back at the cabin, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line across the page, "Closure achieved in silence." Then I packed a small overnight bag. It was time to visit Anchorage again this time, not for protection, but for planning. Howard met me at his office the next morning. He looked pleased, but cautious. "You've been busy," he said. "I read the updates from Sutter and Chen. Smart people to keep close." "I want to go further," I said. "The mineral leases and timber rights are valuable, but I want to make sure the land stays alive. I was thinking of forming a scholarship or a conservation initiative, something that gives back." He nodded slowly. "Then you'll need a foundation under the trust's umbrella. We can draft that." That afternoon, I met with Owen and Mark again, both leaning over the large topographical map that covered Howard's conference table. Owen pointed to the mineral-rich zones marked in blue. "These leases could fund a lot more than maintenance," he said. "If handled right, you could support entire communities out here." Mark tapped another section of the map shaded green. "But this part stays untouched. It's old growth, hundreds of years. You protect it. It protects you." Their voices blended with the scratch of pencils, the shuffle of papers, and the low hum of thought. The plan began to take shape. The Harper Trust would allocate a portion of its returns to education and land preservation. The first branch would be a scholarship for Alaskan students pursuing environmental science named after my mother. When the paperwork was done, I stayed in Anchorage overnight. The city was quiet under a thin veil of snow, streetlights glowing amber against the dusk. From my hotel window, I could see the faint shimmer of the bay. I thought of my parents, of how my father had valued numbers while my mother had trusted words, and how both had somehow led me here to this balance of the two. The next day, before leaving town, I stopped at a jewelry store downtown. I'd brought one of the gold coins from the cellar in a small velvet pouch. The jeweler examined it under a magnifying glass, whistling softly. "Early 20th century," he said. "Mint condition. You could make something beautiful out of this." I nodded. "A pendant. Just one." When he handed it back, polished and gleaming on a thin chain, it looked like something newly born from the earth. I wore it under my sweater as I drove home. By the time I reached the cabin, the late afternoon light had turned the snow pink. I lit a fire, set the pendant on the table, and took out my notebook again. The next page read, "Stage 2 complete. Sustainability over secrecy. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of the forest replaced the clock on my wall. I woke early, worked by day, and wrote each night by lamplight plans, observations, pieces of thought. Anna stopped by sometimes, bringing jars of jam or fresh bread, asking nothing in return. The cabin feels different now," she said once, standing at the doorway. "It feels alive again." One evening, as I was sorting papers near the fire, the phone buzzed again. It was Jenna this time. Her message was short. "Call me. We need to talk." I stared at the screen, then set it face down on the table. For hours I didn't move. The fire burned low, the light flickering across the ledger books stacked neatly on the shelf. My sister's voice from the will reading echoed faintly in memory sweet-controlled, certain of her own victory. When I finally turned the phone over, a second message had arrived. "It's important. Please." I didn't answer that night. Instead, I opened my mother's letter once more, the edges soft from being read so many times. Her words glowed faintly in the lamplight. "We chose by trust, not by favor." I knew then that whatever Jenna wanted, it wasn't closure. It would be something else entirely, something that would test everything I'd built. I slipped the letter back into its sleeve, added another log to the fire, and sat quietly until the flames steadied. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The phone lay on the table beside me. The unread message waiting like a shadow I could already feel moving closer. The message from Jenna stayed on my phone for 2 days before I answered. Her voice came through the line one evening while the wind pushed against the cabin walls. "Grace, please call me back," she said. "It's not about the house. It's about Dad." Her tone was softer than I remembered, almost uncertain. I waited until morning to call. When she picked up, her voice cracked with relief. "Thank God. I didn't think you'd answer." "What's going on?" I asked. "It's Dad," she said quietly. "He's sick. Heart complications. He's stable now, but he's been asking about you." The silence between us stretched. I hadn't heard my father's name spoken in months without tension behind it. "Where is he?" "Seattle," she said. "He's been there for surgery. Mom's with him." I promised to think about visiting, but we both knew that promise carried its own weight. When I hung up, I sat by the fire until the logs collapsed into embers. The anger I'd carried for so long had dulled, but it hadn't disappeared. It just lived quieter now, under layers of something heavier. By the next evening, I'd booked a flight. The cabin, for all its peace, felt too still. I left early, driving through the mist to Anchorage before dawn. The road unfurled beneath the truck's headlights like a ribbon of pale gray ice. When I reached the hospital, Jenna was waiting in the lobby. She looked smaller somehow, her usual confidence dimmed by fatigue. "He's asleep," she said. "Mom's inside." The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. My father's face looked older than his years, lines deepened, hands thinner. My mother sat beside him, her fingers resting lightly on his wrist. She looked up when I entered, and her eyes filled. "Grace," she whispered. I stood at the foot of the bed, unsure what to say. My father's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment confusion crossed his face before recognition took its place. "You came," he said softly. "I did." I answered. He tried to smile, but the effort seemed to tire him. "I wasn't sure you would." Neither was I. We talked in short bursts, separated by long pauses while he caught his breath. He asked about the cabin, about Alaska, and then almost carefully about the trust. "Your mother told me what you've done," he said. "You handled it well. Better than I ever could have imagined." Something in his tone broke through years of distance. For the first time, he wasn't speaking as the man who measured worth in achievements. He sounded like someone trying to make peace with what was left. Jenna returned with coffee, and the room felt warmer for a while. But beneath the surface there was still something fragile, too many years of unspoken blame to erase in a single day. That night I stayed in a small hotel nearby. The city lights flickered outside the window and sleep wouldn't come. I opened my notebook and read through the entries I'd made over the past months, the first discovery, the creation of the trust, the plans for the foundation. It struck me how every decision had been about building distance protection order. Yet now here I was, pulled back to the very people I'd built those walls to escape. The next morning, Jenna met me in the cafeteria. "He's doing better," she said. "The doctors think he'll be home in a week." She hesitated before continuing. "Grace, I owe you an apology. About everything." She looked down at her coffee, twisting the lid between her fingers. "I knew about the house. The way Mom and Dad divided things, it wasn't fair. I thought I deserved it. But after they told me what the cabin really held, I realized what they saw in you. They didn't choose money for me. They chose trust for you." Her words landed softly but deep. For the first time in years, her voice didn't carry that familiar note of competition. She looked tired. Tired of pretending, tired of performing for approval that had never really filled either of us. When I didn't respond right away, she added, "I want to make things right. Maybe not all at once, but I'm ready to start." I nodded slowly. "Then start by being honest with yourself and with them." We spent the afternoon at the hospital helping Mom fill out discharge papers and talking about plans for Dad's recovery. When I left that evening, Jenna hugged me for the first time in years. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet and real. Back in Alaska, the cabin greeted me with the faint scent of pine smoke and familiar warmth. I unpacked, set my phone on the counter, and saw a voicemail waiting from Howard. His calm voice filled the room. "Grace, the foundation paperwork's finalized. The Harper Trust Foundation is officially recognized. Congratulations." I sat at the table, the weight of those words settling in. The work, the secrecy, the long months of isolation, it had all led to this. I thought of my mother's handwriting in the letter tucked safely on the shelf. We chose by trust, not by favor. That evening, I called Howard back. "Let's schedule the first grant review," I said. "We'll start with education and conservation proposals from local communities." He chuckled softly. "You sound like your grandfather," he said. He always believed in slow, careful beginnings. Over the next weeks, the foundation took shape. Letters arrived from students, foresters, small-town schools, each one carrying stories of hope of projects waiting for a chance. I read every line, my notebook filling with notes and plans. The money beneath the floorboards had turned into something alive, something that reached beyond the walls of this cabin. One morning, I received an envelope from Jenna. Inside was a photograph of our parents sitting together on their porch, sunlight in their faces. On the back, she'd written, "Dad says thank you for coming." I pinned the photo to the cabin wall beside my grandfather's old picture. The two generations looked back at me different times, same quiet thread of resilience. That night, as the wind moved through the trees, I felt the cabin settle around me like a heartbeat. The trust, the foundation, the family I'd spent years trying to untangle all of it had found a strange kind of balance. Not perfect, but steady. I poured a cup of tea and stood at the window watching the last traces of daylight fade behind the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a lone bird calling out before night took over. The sound lingered in the cold air, a reminder of both distance and connection. Tomorrow, I would sign the first grant approval. The money would go to a group of students restoring a section of forest near Talkeetna. Anna had helped organize it. She'd written in her letter, "Your family built bridges you couldn't see. You're rebuilding them in your own way." I smiled at that, setting the letter beside the fire. The flames caught the edges of the paper's light, flickering softly. The phone buzzed once on the table, another message from Jenna, this time a simple one. "Dad's home. He's reading your foundation article online. He's proud." I didn't respond right away. I just stood there letting the quiet fill the space. For the first time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, patient, familiar. The cabin light glowed through the windows, steady against the dark. And though part of me knew there was still one chapter left to write, the rest finally felt whole. When spring finally broke in full, the forest around the cabin turned alive with sound. The river ran louder, the air smelled of damp moss and birch, and the snowmelt traced silver lines down the slope behind the house. It felt as if the world had exhaled. Inside my desk was covered in letters, some from the students whose scholarships had just been approved, others from small towns asking about future grants. Each envelope carried a piece of what this trust was meant to become. I spent my mornings walking the property line, listening to the sound of the thaw. The ground underfoot was soft, and wildflowers pushed through where snow had been only weeks before. Sometimes I thought about my parents sitting on their porch back home, my mother reading while my father nursed a cup of coffee, both of them quieter now, perhaps a little gentler with time. Jenna called often, and her tone was different. No rivalry, no careful posing. She'd started helping with the foundation's outreach, using her talent for communication to tell stories that needed to be heard. It was strange and comforting working side by side again, even from a distance. One morning I received a small package postmarked from Seattle. Inside was a handwritten note from my father, his handwriting thin but steady. Grace. I was wrong to think success was something I could measure in numbers. You've built something lasting, the kind of legacy a man like me couldn't have imagined. Your mother says I smile more these days. I think she's right. We're proud of you. Beneath the note was a small brass compass, the kind he used to carry on his job sites when I was little. The needle still swung true. I set it on the shelf beside my grandfather's old ledger, and for the first time, the two pieces of my family felt like they belonged in the same room. As the weeks passed, the Harper Trust Foundation began its first project. With Mark Chen's help, we funded a replanting effort on a damaged stretch of forest near Talkeetna, where wildfires had stripped the land bare years earlier. Students from Anchorage came out to help, their laughter echoing through the valley as they dug and watered and built fences to keep moose away from the young saplings. Watching them work, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the wind, steady, approving, patient. Anna stopped by the cabin one evening with a loaf of bread and a stack of local newspapers. The foundation's work had made the front page of the regional edition. She set the paper on the table and smiled. It's a good thing, she said, seeing something grow again in this valley. We shared dinner by the fire, and when she left, I stood in the doorway long after her truck lights faded through the trees. The sky was deep blue, almost violet, and for the first time I realized how fully this place had become home. A few days later, Jenna called to tell me Dad had started walking again. He keeps that compass with him, she said. Says it reminds him that direction matters more than speed. We both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carries more relief than humor. It was a small thing, but it felt like healing, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in over time. That evening I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the last streaks of daylight fade behind the pines. The cabin had changed, but so had I. The woman who first arrived here with nothing but a key and a letter had been searching for worth in proof and paper. The woman sitting here now understood that some inheritances aren't about wealth at all. They're about trust, endurance, and the courage to stand alone until it no longer feels lonely. I looked out at the forest alive again, steady and green, and thought of how the past had folded into the present without needing to erase what came before. The gold, the ledgers, the land they had all started as symbols of silence and secrecy. Now they had become tools for growth, for giving back, for peace. The next morning I wrote one last entry in my notebook. The legacy isn't what you hold, it's what you let grow when you stop holding so tightly. I closed the cover and set it beside the compass. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cool, the wind gentle against my face. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker knocked out a slow rhythm, steady and certain. If my parents ever came to visit, I knew they would find the cabin not as a reminder of distance, but as proof of what love looks like when it's finally allowed to breathe. Before I turned in for the night, I stood for a moment in the doorway, the fire behind me, and the stars beginning to appear over the ridge. I whispered a quiet thank you to my mother for her letter to my grandfather, for his patience, and to the younger version of myself who hadn't given up when everything felt lost. The forest answered with silence, and somehow that felt enough. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from something that looked like nothing, I hope my story reminds you that peace doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, like snow melting into spring, like forgiveness arriving at last. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share it or tell me where you're listening from. I'd like to believe stories like this find the people who need them most.